Good morning. Missed you guys. I think last week was the first time I ever missed church as a pastor. There was another Pastor John. I know he has much more hair than this one, so you guys were fortunate for that. And yeah, it's a pretty good deal that you can send a message to someone that doesn't live here the day before and be like, hey, are you available? Yes, let me ask, but yes. And so I'm so grateful for Pastor John, and he was able to come and be with you. And yeah, he was prepared, but he wasn't prepared. Do you know how that goes? But we're in this series on Lent, and I told him just whatever, just bring the word. And so he did that. And so we're in the season of Lent, but today's really like the message from last week. And it was just one of those times where I was like, I think I could probably exist in the building, but I don't think like my voice would work, or I could stand, or I could keep my eyes open. So, I think it was probably best that John was here for that, for everyone's sake. I was wondering about this. Scent as far as smell goes, there's probably something that comes to mind that stands out to you of being like the top. And so I kind of thought about this week, and I was wondering, like, what would be even the top 10, not like a Letterman top 10, but just like a general top 10 that most of us would agree on. And so I need your participation. If there's one that stands out here, or if there's an honorable mention, you can even just shout it out. Why not? So in no particular order, just let me know if this would resonate with you, if this scent would be one that you love to experience. Cookies out of the oven. Okay, yeah. Could we have some? I know there's cake, but could we get on the cookies too? Someone ready? Coffee brewing, especially in the morning. Yeah, for the first one's for my soul, the second one's for my head, third one so that I can exist among like a community, right? Fresh cut grass. Not soon enough, right? Fresh cut grass, that's a good one. Bacon cooking? Yeah, praise Jesus that we can have bacon, right? That takes me back to being like maybe 4 years old, and I grew up with my grandparents, and I guess like just the timing worked out that my grandfather still had a couple of years of work left, and so he'd get up early in the morning, and he'd be cooking bacon, and so my eyes would come open, and my nose would come open, and I would sneak around into the kitchen, and he didn't prepare enough for me, but he would share. He's like, yeah, you can have some. And it's like, bacon's precious. There's not a lot to go around, but I still love that smell. It takes me back to the 80s on Prince Street. What about barbecue? Are you ever jealous? You get home from work, or you just like open your window and you're like, why are they barbecuing? Like now I'm hungry. Now I know what I want. I'm not ready to cook burgers, but I want them. Campfire? A couple people like that one, I guess. Cinnamon buns at the landing. When they come out and they put the stuff over it and it starts melting, you guys know. Yeah, just over here. If you can ever get across that bridge, or if you're already on that side, it's too soon. Freshly baked bread. You walk into a place or into a house where that's going on. And this one's an interesting one. Like, I don't know how to articulate it, but the air outside after it rains. Do you know what I mean? Any honorable mentions? Anything I'm missing? There's probably some good ones in there, but I especially love if I've been outside and I've been doing anything. I remember being a kid and like ball hockey, you would go until you were ready to die, and then you'd come in the house and there would be some great meal, just the experience, and it would fill the house. You'll get the sense of where the scent comes in this context in a moment, but really the subject, if we wanted to get down to just one sentence about what today is all about, is this passage that we're going to look at. It's all about the worthiness of Jesus. It's all about how worthy Jesus is. We always sing that, and we're going to look at that in a passage today. And the reason we need to look at this and discuss this and take some time to experience this together is because Jesus is worthy of the very best that we can offer. Is that true to you? That's true for me. We need to give all of ourselves to Jesus. That's really the point, to pour out our very best at the feet of Jesus. And so we're actually going to look at a passage that was part of our Lent reading last week. And what I love about our Lent reading is it's kind of bite sizes that are going somewhat chronological. We can't be 100% certain of that, but it's kind of exploring the Synoptic Gospels and John. And today's passage will be from John. And I just want to remind you, the reason that we do something like this, last year we had a reading plan, and one of the benefits of it is that by the end of that season of Lent, taking us into the weekend of Easter, celebrating the resurrection, by that point we had read through the entire Gospel of Mark. It was pretty cool to do that, but also as a community to be sort of on the same page, to be reading through it together. And so we have the opportunity this season. If you haven't already begun, it's not too late. But here's a reminder of why we would read the Bible as individuals and why we would read it as a community. I'll tell you why we do. One reason, like the non-reason, it's not just to check off a box and say, I did my reading today. That is not really the reason why we're doing it. I heard someone say years ago, we're not reading the Bible to finish, we're reading the Bible to change. That's really the point, to be changed by it, but ultimately by the Lord, by our God. So join us if you will, and we would love, it's not too late and it's not too much to catch up as well. Sundays are a holiday from the reading because then we get to come together in community and look at a passage together, and so that's what we're looking at today. If you think about stories, especially in the Gospels, most of them are about Jesus doing kind of a good thing for someone or to someone. You know, mostly it's Jesus doing something to or for someone else. But the story we're going to look at is actually someone doing a good thing for him. We're going to look at three people mentioned in the story today. There's more than three, but the three in particular are Judas, not really anyone's favorite, right? Mary and Lazarus. And people often wonder, what can Jesus do for them, or what can Jesus do for me? But instead today we're going to ask the question, what can I do for Jesus? So could you just draw your attention to the screen? We're going to read this passage that is in our reading from last week. And it's the first 11 verses of John chapter 12. It says, 6 days before the Passover celebration began, Jesus arrived in Bethany, the home of Lazarus, the man he had raised from the dead. A dinner was prepared in Jesus' honor. Martha served, and Lazarus was among those who ate with him. Then Mary took a 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume made from essence of nard, and she anointed Jesus' feet with it. Wiping his feet with her hair, the house was filled with the fragrance. But Judas Iscariot, the disciple who would soon betray him, said, that perfume was worth a year's wages. It should have been sold and the money given to the poor. Not that he cared for the poor. He was a thief, and since he was in charge of the disciples' money, he often stole some for himself. Jesus replied, leave her alone. She did this in preparation for my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. When all the people heard of Jesus' arrival, they flocked to see him and also to see Lazarus, the man Jesus had raised from the dead. Then the leading priests decided to kill Lazarus too, for it was because of him that many people had deserted them and believed in Jesus. Father, we thank you for this opportunity today to look into this passage, and we thank you for the opportunity to get to read it together as a community and now get a chance to discuss it. Thanks also for today that's Baptism Sunday. Thanks for the tank that's prepared, and thank you for those that are ready to enter the waters today. We thank you for their decision and that we get to celebrate that together. It's an awesome thing to see what they're ready to do along with you on this journey. And so would you bless them today as well? And bless us as we're encountering you and your word. Would we not leave the way that we came in, but would we be changed by not just this reading, but ultimately by you today? We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Yeah, the first character we're going to look at for just a moment is Judas. It's not, if there were like almost like hockey cards or sports cards for the disciples. You probably wouldn't trade the Judas one, or maybe you would. Maybe you would just like get rid of the Judas one. That's not one that you're looking to collect. Judas gets a bad rap, but for lots of reasons. You can even see John kind of interpreting right in the middle of the story some thoughts about him, even interpreting the motive behind something he said. And also because we know the story now, but for the reader or listener the first time, they would have been hearing, oh, he's actually about to betray Jesus, right in the context of this today. So Judas, yeah, he was one of the disciples, one of the ones who followed Jesus and was a part of that ministry, but it's a great reminder that being around Jesus doesn't guarantee faithfulness to him. It's not enough to just be around and in his presence. There's much more to do than just be around him. And we know from John's account that the leading priests and Pharisees were looking for this opportunity to arrest Jesus. We also know from the other accounts that Judas began to betray Jesus, and this was happening kind of in the background. We read in Mark chapter 14, you'll see in verses 10 and 11, it says, "Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples, went to the leading priests to arrange to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted when they heard why he had come, and they promised to give him money. So he began looking for an opportunity to betray Jesus." Hindsight, right? But we now see that he probably wasn't the best one to be the treasurer for their money. He often took some for himself, as John noted. Excuse me. Judas was actually, in our context, in this story, he was questioning Mary's motive and commenting on that, all while disguising his own motive. You know, Proverbs 16 says it this way: people may be pure in their own eyes, but the Lord examines their motives. Of course, that's true, and that's something that we see to be true, and here is an example of that. N.T. Wright mentions this: not everyone is called to pour out expensive ointment over Jesus' head, or in this case, feet, but if someone is, the rest should respect it. It seems like he's speaking for the group, but he's kind of suggesting that it is not something that they're respecting at the time. You can also note something that both James and Peter mentioned in their letters that comes from the Greek version of Proverbs 3:34, where the scriptures say, God opposes the proud but favors the humble. This is a story about God actually honoring someone who's humbling themselves and calling out someone who actually is very proud. The second character that we're looking at, and really a main character to set up the scene, but not the most important person there, just the one to really frame this event, is Mary. Minor mention is Martha. She's serving at this dinner in Jesus' honor. We actually don't hear a word from Mary, which is also a reminder that sometimes actions speak much louder than words. Actually, what many comment is that they wouldn't have been seen or heard except when these women were serving food and drink. In this culture and at this time, they wouldn't have been at the table, they would have been serving the table. And so that's another reason why we probably don't hear something from her. When I looked into the passage a year ago in Mark's account, there was this $5 word. Is this $5 Sunday? High five, right? Some people give $5. Some people give $5.55. Some people give $55.55. Others. Anyone given $500? You don't have to mention now, but maybe your receipt next year could represent, and there'd be a 5 in that. That's kind of, isn't it fun to be generous? I think so. A $5 word I learned last year was this word, incommensurable. And I don't even think I'm saying it right now, just for the record. Incommensurable. It's really that Mary realized that Jesus, that word has to do with his worth being beyond comparison. And so you cannot really use common standards because his worth is extraordinary. It's beyond. That incommensurable is that $5 word that really means that No, you can't just compare Jesus to a year's wages. You can't just compare him to a dollar amount as Judas ultimately does. No, Jesus is worthy of the very best she can offer, and he's worthy of the very best that we can offer, and so much more. No gift, not even a year's salary, is wasted on Jesus, but it's still not enough to express how much he is worth. But it is important to note, since money's being talked about here, that no, he doesn't desire the best money has to offer. He actually desires the best that we have to offer. I love how it's noted in Mark's account. She has done what she could. She has done what she could. She was able to give something that was seemingly extraordinary, and that really brought notice to everyone else, and they had comments on where that money could have gone. Jesus is actually quoting something from Deuteronomy, saying that, no, the poor will always be among you, and he's not making a comment on any problem with helping the poor, not at all. But in this context, he's actually interpreting something. You know, this story, it's coming part of our Lent reading, but it's also kind of the beginning of what's called Passion Week, or the Passion literature. Passion, not just in terms of passionate or love, but actually from that original in the Greek or in Latin to suffer. Jesus is about to suffer, whether they fully grasp it yet or not. And he's interpreting it for them that, no, you won't always have me physically speaking. And so she's doing this good thing for me. Many have noted this, that the value of a gift signals the value of the person to whom it is given. Jesus isn't worth merely a year's wages. He's worth infinitely more, but this is a signal of the most Mary could possibly give at the time. She gave everything that she could to him. She did it humbly. And then Jesus made her motive known. I love, in Mark, Jesus said, this woman's deed will be remembered and discussed. Here we are discussing it today. Something that she did, not something that she said. Her story spread further and wider than the fragrance ever could because of Jesus making this known to us. That's the thought of the scent, right? Something that fills the house. The whole room, the whole house was filled with this fragrance. Many of you are probably not wearing Essence of Nard today. It's not super popular. There were no Super Bowl ads for it or anything like that. But I've heard that it has kind of an earthy, spicy smell. And many people comment on how when something like that is broken open, or even when you sample a perfume or a fragrance, usually the initial kind of burst of it lasts for minutes. Right? And then it kind of wears off, but then it still kind of lingers, you know. Sometimes people use infusers and things like that. Have you ever noticed someone might use that and walk by you and you're like, I am now infused. My nostrils are now infused with whatever they were infused with. I'm sure that this smell lingered and helped them to remember this much longer. Smell is also a part of memory. And so perhaps that is why John is trying to get this across to us, partially for the value, but also for this lingering and this kind of presence that kind of penetrated and moved around all of these people. She did it humbly. In 1 Peter, in his letter, he writes, so humble yourselves under the mighty power of God, and at the right time, he will lift you up in honor. Often when I've thought about people sitting at the table, sometimes there's an asterisk and there's kind of a footnote about them reclining. And so they're not sitting at a table like we would normally sit for our style of dinners. No, it was actually much, much lower to the floor, and there were cushions around. And generally speaking, because they would eat with their right hand, they would lean on their left elbow on cushions, and their feet would be out behind them. And so you can picture a number of, especially men, around this table, and it's in Jesus' honor. And so we know that Martha is one that's serving, and perhaps Mary has finished her duties or finished them earlier. She probably thought about this for a while. this jar that we hear about, it's an alabaster jar in other translations, and we know that it costs, roughly a year's wages. And so whether she saved up or whether this was a family heirloom, for her to decide to use this, it was costly. It was costly to her. It's not something she could have done again. Many comment on how she broke the jar, meaning it can never be used again. She's deciding to pour it all out. None of it's going back in. I don't know if you've ever let a little too much toothpaste out. It's really hard to put it back in the tube. Well, this even more so. She's not putting any of this essence of nard back in the jar. It is all going to be used on Jesus. In another translation, it's actually poured on his head. Many think that whether it's his head or his feet is not really an issue. It's more of that the author is trying to say if it's his head, then he's being anointed as the Messiah, as the King. But at his feet, it's no less significant other than it's for the humility of the one doing it. And so at just the right time, as she has already been humbled, God is actually lifting her up in this moment and continuing to do so to honor the memory of this thing that she has done for Jesus. It's a good thing that she did for him, and then he returned the favor in honoring and respecting what she did, even to kind of shut out the comments that others were making. Not only did Jesus lift her up, but he interpreted the event and made it about his burial, his death, and his burial. So this act kind of initiated the Passion Week in John's context. It kind of set it up, this idea that Jesus would suffer. He commented on it before, but they didn't understand at the time. They didn't think that the Messiah should come and suffer, even though there was lots of prediction and foreshadowing of that. Jesus would suffer and die in just a few days. He's interpreting that this woman who didn't say a word is actually doing this to prepare him for this event. It's as though she's preparing him for burial, even though he hasn't yet suffered. This is how he's interpreting it for her. Mary gave what she could, and so we must ask, what can we do? What can you do for Jesus? It makes me think of worship. Worship is often, in our context, done in music. Something kind of cool this last week on Wednesday, one of our citywide youth events, we went up to Journey, and something Luke had prepared for us is instead of using music, which is fine, and we did that when we hosted, he actually had A through Z, or A through Z, A through Z because he's American, A through Z because we're Canadian, but he had the letters of the alphabet spread out on paper throughout the sanctuary up there. And there were markers. There was kind of a small explanation in how some of the letters you might have to be creative, but it was actually in adoration to the Lord, is talking in a group and then going and writing down, starting with A, what's something that you could write down that brings the Lord to mind. It could be Abba, Father. It could be awesome. It could be anything. And as we went through the letters, I think X was kind of tricky, but we were able to kind of make notes on all of these, and that was a way that we were able to express our worship. Worship is often seen as an offering or a sacrifice. It's showing, or rather ascribing, the worth of something or someone. Bowing low, as this woman would have been doing, or even being face down, is a humbling yourself before, in this case, before Jesus. It's a great thing to ask ourselves, to check our own motives. Do we come to worship to give, or do we come to worship to get? Sometimes we come because we need to be filled up, but often we should take the perspective that we actually need to be emptied before the Lord. The third and final character we're going to mention out of this story is Lazarus. He's actually mentioned a couple times, and it's this repetitive nature at the beginning and at the end of this passage. And so anytime something's repeated like that in your own study, you should ask the question, why? What is the author, or what is the Lord trying to say to me by repeating this? In the first verse, it says, Lazarus, the man he had raised from the dead, the man Jesus raised from the dead. And then in verse 9, near the very end of the passage, Lazarus, the man Jesus had raised from the dead. Well, we know that if we just went back one page, went back one chapter, there's this whole story that Lazarus had died, and Lazarus was a friend of Jesus, and we find the smallest or the shortest verse in the Bible. We find in verse 35 of chapter 11, Jesus wept. It's simple, but it's profound that his emotions came out in that way. Why does John repeat this in chapter 12? Lazarus, the man he had raised from the dead, the man that Jesus had raised from the dead. Well, because death comes before resurrection, before a lifting up. Jesus raised Lazarus. Jesus is about to die, and Jesus himself is going to be raised. Isn't this also an illustration of baptism today? I'm so excited that we get to do this. Colossians 2:12 puts it this way: for you were buried with Christ when you were baptized. That's that idea of going under the water. It's as though you're buried with Christ. And with him you were also raised to new life because you trusted the mighty power of God who raised Christ from the dead. It's a beautiful image of that Good Friday and then that Easter Sunday, that resurrection experience. There's this sense of being humbled and then being lifted up. There's this sense of dying to yourself and being buried with Jesus, and there's this sense of being raised. You're now a new life. What James says is to humble yourself before the Lord, and he will lift you up in honor. I don't know how often you read the King James Version, but something that's kind of funny, I think, in the language about Lazarus comes in verse 39. The King James reads this way: Jesus said, "Take ye away the stone. Martha, the sister of him that was dead, saith unto him, Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been dead 4 days." He stinketh. This is pretty good. I'm glad it's not a smell-o-vision or another smell I guess I could have mentioned is either old books or new books. There's just something about that. But I'm so glad that doesn't have to waft into your study. Why mention the smell? Well, yeah, in chapter 11, the fragrance filled the tomb, and they wanted it to be contained there. Now in chapter 11, the fragrance filled the room. The whole house was filled with the fragrance. Is it something to be said that Jesus even changes that wretched, putrid smell to something desirable that is expensive and luxurious? Does he change even fragrance? Perhaps. It's an illustration of filling a place. It's something that actually his presence does. Often, though, there's comments of whether it's the voices of the people or the praises of the people or the offerings of the people expanding in a way, filling a place. Perhaps it's being surrounded or maybe even overwhelmed. And so today, really what we're looking at in this passage is that Jesus, of course, he's worthy of the very best we can offer. Not all of us have a jar that's really expensive, that is about a year's wages. Nah. And even if we did, that's maybe a one-time opportunity to break open and pour out for Jesus, even symbolically. No, we don't all have that, but we have something. What is the best that we can actually offer him? We all need to give all of ourselves to Jesus. The team's going to come to close us in a song here in a moment. But simply, the application would be for us to pour out our very best at the feet of Jesus. What does that look like? We know Scripture expresses that one day every knee will bow. Every knee will bow. Every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. People have an opportunity now to choose and to do this willingly, really, to pour out. Consider it an overflow from your heart. So you must think surrender is part of this. What does surrender, what does submission look like to you? You will need to wrestle personally. What does it look like for you personally? Some of you that are still working, you might have to think, what does this look like for me professionally? What about in a private or small gathering? And then what about in a public place? We know that Jesus is worthy, and so we must determine how will we demonstrate his worth, whether we're in private or whether we're in public. It's easy to do when we're all together and singing and we're doing this together. Sometimes it's harder to do when we're worried about confusing maybe the motives or someone judging, perhaps even wrongly. I think that can get in the way of this. But for some reason, one thing that I've noticed from this woman, no, I can't with my own hair get down and use it to wipe the feet of Jesus, but without using words and without fearing what other people will say, she did it anyway. She did it without regard for other people's opinion. All that really mattered to her was Jesus. What about for you?